Let's yap a little bit. Now, I'm sure by now you saw this little performance from Iowa Senator Joni Ernst.
We're talking about the corrections in this reconciliation bill. Again, it's corrections of overpayments and people that have not been eligible for these programs by law as it is currently written. So when you are arguing about illegals that are receiving Medicaid benefits, 1.4 million, 1.4, they are not eligible, so they will be coming off. So people are not, well, we all are going to die. So for heaven's sakes.
Now, I've been writing about American politics for about 15 years. Now, I've been covering attacks on the social safety net from Republicans that entire time. It's a bit of an obsession of mine. I care quite a bit about the survival of the American welfare state and its expansion. In all that time, I've grown very accustomed to Republicans making outlandish attacks on safety net programs. I've gotten used to them lying about those programs, telling untruths in order to convince Americans to cut them. You're seeing that right now with Speaker Mike Johnson as he claims to say that no one will lose health insurance if Republicans slash Medicaid by hundreds of billions of dollars.
This is a very important distinction. Those 4.8 million people will not lose their Medicaid unless they choose to do so.
That's a bold-faced lie, but of course, I'm used to it. This is what they do. What I find genuinely interesting is a lawmaker defending their support for large cuts, not by downplaying the significance of the cuts, but by saying, listen, you're going to die anyway. You're going to die, and if you die, you die.
If he dies, he dies.
What's all the more remarkable is that Ernst followed this up with a TikTok video, I guess, where she suggested that her constituents who were upset with her were just in denial about the ultimate mortality of all living things.
People are going to die. And I made an incorrect assumption that everyone in the auditorium understood that, yes, we are all going to perish from this earth. So I apologize. And I'm really, really glad that I did not have to bring up the subject of the tooth fairy as well.
Now, I don't think that's the issue. I think the issue is that people, knowing that they will die eventually, would prefer that to happen later in life, when they're older and infirm, and not when they're relatively young. They would prefer not to die because they just couldn't get access to health insurance, which is what will happen if you cut Medicaid. A recent study suggests that something on the order of 52,000 Americans will die annually if these cuts go through. Preventable deaths, people who would be alive but are not because of the Medicaid cuts. And the most recent Congressional Budget Office estimate says that about 10.9 million people will lose health insurance because of the cuts Ernst supports to Medicaid and the Affordable Care Act. But I'm not going to focus on that stuff. I want to focus on this message that death is inevitable, so why are you complaining about these cuts? It's so callous, strikingly so, and yet it feels of a piece for where the Republican Party has gone in the age of Trump. There's throughout the Trumpified Republican Party just an outright contempt for the weak, an outright contempt for those who might be suffering, an outright contempt for life, to put it as simply as possible. You see it in the enthusiasm, of course, for benefit cuts. You saw it in the previous Trump administration's approach to the COVID pandemic, which was total indifference to the fact that hundreds of thousands of Americans, and soon over 1 million, would perish as a result of the virus. And we're witnessing it right now in the eagerness of the administration to deport a 4-year-old girl who will die if she cannot stay where she currently lives, California, and receive advanced medical treatment.
And a 4-year-old girl is fighting for her life in a U.S. hospital and is now facing deportation. The family came to the U.S. from Mexico legally on humanitarian grounds in 2023, but in April, the Trump administration terminated their parole and ordered them to self-deport. And now the girl's doctors say that she could die within days if that happens.
They just don't care. Doesn't matter to them. Now, some of this is clearly just ideology, right? Someone like a Stephen Miller or a Russell Vought clearly believes that there's no amount of suffering that will delegitimize their aims. They want to construct a certain kind of world, and they're willing to pursue it by any means possible at whatever cost it might demand. And in the case of someone like Stephen Miller, it's very clear, to borrow a phrase from the Atlantic writer Adam Serwer, that the cruelty is the point. Part of what he wants to do is inflict cruelty on people, inflict suffering on people for the sake of his vision of what America ought to be. And this merges with a more traditional, you could say, conservative contempt for people who are on assistance, people who aren't at the commanding heights of the society, and turns into something quite ugly, quite uniquely ugly, I think. But I think there's something else here that is uniquely Trump. It is the president's own glorification of cruelty, the president's own sense that the purpose of life on earth is for the powerful to dominate the weak.
Written by a nice reporter. Now the poor guy, you got to see this guy. Oh, I don't know what I said. I don't remember. He's going like, I don't remember. Oh, maybe that's what I said.
For people with money and status and influence to have it all, even if that comes at the expense of those who have relatively little. The president clearly revels in cruelty for its own sake, clearly desires nothing more than to dominate everyone who comes within his purview. It doesn't matter how marginally he'll gain, he'll humiliate you if he thinks it will benefit him. I don't think the president would articulate it in these terms, but he's essentially internalized a deeply social Darwinistic worldview. And so have other people in the administration, for that matter, not to just pin all the blame on Trump. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. clearly believes in a survival of the fittest kind of world. His opposition to vaccines, to all kinds of medical treatment, mainstream medical treatment, seems to rest on the idea that nature will determine who lives and who dies. And if you die of a preventable disease, let's say measles, it's because you were ontologically fated to die. You were sick for whatever reason. Maybe you didn't take good enough care of yourself. Maybe your body just wasn't equipped to handle the disease. Your natural immunity wasn't strong enough. You died, and that's the way things were supposed to be. Or as Kennedy said in reference to measles cases, that only sick children are going to die.
In 2025.
Well, there's only 3 deaths from measles in 20 years. And they're all people with extreme complications. And
that's how you die from measles, because of the complications of it.
Yeah, it's people who are already sick.
As if sick children is its own category. As if to be sick is to somehow forfeit your right to receive treatment, to not die of preventable illnesses. It's a political movement dedicated to reveling in its worst impulses, reveling in all the things that we traditionally conceive of as being vices, deadly sins. Moral bankruptcy becomes a virtue, and virtue is signaling. It's not real, it doesn't matter. Which loops us all the way back to Joni Ernst and her dismissal of the real harm her preferred policies are going to cause with a simple, well, we're all going to die anyway.
Well, we all are going to die, going to die, going to die, going to die.
It's an explicit statement that your life doesn't matter, that my ideological vision, that my desires, that my wants are more important than your health, more important than your ability to live. Years ago, when I was, I think, still in high school, there was not especially good book by a noted conservative editor called The Party of Death. And it was about how the American liberalism was pro-death. And most of this rested on support for abortion rights and reproductive autonomy, which gives you a sense of how persuasive the book might have been. But I've been thinking about that book recently, again, not because it's good, but because that framework, a political party that seems to welcome death, or at least have no real regard for life, feels very salient right now. Whether it's Medicaid and health insurance, or climate, or our environment, or our ability to have safe food and medicine. The current administration, the current regime, seems dedicated to the proposition that your life just doesn't matter all that much. Now, one question is whether there is a way out of this, whether this has done too much damage to American culture. And I do think that the gratuitous cruelty and indifference to life that marks this political movement has coarsened our entire national life. I think it helps explain some of the uglier things we're seeing bubble up from the bottom up into society, which means that there's not going to be an easy way back out of this. But what I think it demands is that those of us who are opposed to this cannot adopt those methods, cannot adopt that gratuitous cruelty. As difficult as it might be, those of us opposed to this might have to really try to live out and embrace an ethos of responsibility to each other, of solidarity with each other, of care and generosity and decency. Those of us who want a more fair society, a more egalitarian society, are not going to get there through the outright domination of others. The two things are incompatible with each other on a very basic level. And so that's where I want to end this. They might say that who cares, you're going to die anyway. And I think that we have to say, we care because we want you to live.